Great. Hello all and welcome to our National Youth Panel on exploring COVID-19 and the new normal. We hope you've all settled in and you're ready to spend the next hour and a bit with us. We can see your chats coming through, but we can't see you and we can't hear you, so don't worry about muting or unmuting yourself or your camera. My name is Mehak and I'm the Youth Leadership Officer at MYAN Australia and very excited to be moderating today's event, what we hope to be a dynamic and informative event for all. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the lands across Australia in which we're meeting today. I'm on the lands of the people of the Kulin Nation and would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, emerging, and those who are joining us today. As a migrant myself on this land, I also want to acknowledge and to recognise the Indigenous community's continuing connection to land, sea and community, and acknowledge that they've looked after this land for generations and should continue to do so as the leaders and drivers of the lands. Over the past few months, we have all felt the interruptions of COVID-19 to a varying degree. Some have had lockdown with large families or alone for weeks, while others are navigating disrupted education and employment pathways. And the uncertainty around it all has brought multiple mental health and well-being challenges. At the moment, this all looks very different around the country, as you would know, with some states and territories well and truly out of lockdown and others re-entering into it. So it remains a really uncertain time for many, but everyone is talking about the new normal, which is what we're also going to do today. We know that young people are experiencing the societal and economic impacts of COVID-19 disproportionately, both in short-term and in long-term recovery. And this is, in fact, magnified for young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds. While this is the case, we know that this group of young people have enormous strengths and capabilities, and they have played critical roles in their communities to support families and communities in the pandemic. And we saw this very well articulated or very accurately in the recent strict and swift lockdowns in Melbourne. But these are often overlooked as the particular and long-standing access and equity barriers. And this is why we've put together a panel of incredible youth representatives from WA, Queensland, Victoria, and New South Wales to share their experiences. This panel is complementary to others we have seen in the past couple of months in the youth sector and has a purpose to add to the conversation, bringing in diverse perspectives. Before we hear from the panelists, which I'm sure you're all excited to do so, I just want to run through some protocols of how we will run and ways in which you can engage today with us. The first is that this event is being recorded and also broadcasted on our Facebook page. So welcome from Facebook if you're watching us over there. On your screen, you will see a chat functionality and a Q&A option at the bottom. This is if you're on Zoom with us. Please put your questions in the Q&A tab. These can be liked by other audience members and they kind of boost up a little bit similar to Slido if you've used that before. And if you're having any technical issues or you want to make a comment about something, please post these in the chat box. Great, so there has never been a more important time to ensure young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds in Australia can access the support and opportunities they need to realise their potential and thrive, and ensure that massive disruptions of COVID-19 in all areas of their life are addressed now and in the longer term. So with saying that, let's hear from the panel. We'll start off with an introduction of each panelist in a bit of an order and then kick off with some questions. So welcome, my panelists. I'm very excited to be spending this morning with you. Could you start by telling us a little bit about yourselves and your reflections on COVID-19?
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Mehak. I'm Zahra, everyone. I'm joining in from Western Australia, Perth, Noongar Budja. I'm a law and journalism student here, and I am from a migrant and refugee background from Iraq and Palestine. Over the past few months, it has certainly been quite challenging for myself, especially growing up in a large family. I've had family trapped overseas for months. I've struggled with my own mental health issues, and I've had to study online when it's been absolute chaos in my house, hearing volume from every centre. Despite that, I think that we must persevere and we must fight for a better world ahead of us. As such, I'm currently volunteering with MYAN as their National Youth Ambassador. I also work with the Youth Affairs Council in Perth as a shout-out speaker and delivering migrant and refugee trainings to young leaders. Thank you.
Thank you, Zahra. Swathi next.
Thanks, Mehak. Hi to everyone. I come to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people. I also pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that these are some difficult and strange times that we're all navigating. I'm Swathi. I am the Victorian State Ambassador to the Youth Advocacy Network to MYAN Australia. And I'm also connected with the Centre for Multicultural Youth here in Melbourne. I like to describe myself or think of myself as some sort of a good example of youth engagement done right. I was a young person who came through one of the youth advisory groups at the Centre for Multicultural Youth back when I was a law and commerce student at uni, a very confused law and commerce student, now a lawyer, but I actually work at CMY now, and I am in the very privileged position to be able to work with young people during these really confusing times and give back a little bit of what I think I've learned and gained through some of my experiences. So I work at CMY, and then I'm also volunteering with MYAN, and I also run my own initiative called the Million Project, which is focused on promoting the social and economic participation of people affected by menstrual health conditions and invisible illnesses, because I really believe in talking about smashing stigma and talking about the relationship between menstrual health and mental health and employment, and how we can create a sustainable, less stigmatized future for everyone.
Thank you, Swathi.
Good morning all, my name is Butrus Friday Haider. I am in Queensland. I come to you from the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land as well. As a refugee who seeks refuge, it's your home that I call home today. So I'd like to acknowledge that. I'd also like to acknowledge any of our South Sudanese elders or leaders that are in the chat today. I only speak because you have given me the passageway to speak, so I'd like to acknowledge all of you. And also shout out to Multicultural Youth Queensland and our awesome team over there and the great work that you all do. I am part of the council, currently a sports and, what do I do? I currently work in Football Queensland and currently part of the Multicultural Youth Council. So looking forward to the chat.
Great, thanks, Butrus. Oh, we'll just unmute. Great, thanks.
Unmute that button. Hello everyone. Hi everyone, I'm Harpreet Dhillon, and I'm here today as a Youth Ambassador for Multicultural Youth Affairs, New South Wales. And I just like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I am sitting and standing on Gadigal lands, and sovereignty was never ceded. And so I'm here to represent my ancestry with my cultural ties of Punjabi, Indian and Pakistani. My grandparents were refugees from Pakistan to India, and addition to this, I would like to provide insights of the experiences of the young people who are at risk from the advocacy and youth work that I've been doing for the past couple of years now. And definitely the reflection that I have had for COVID-19 has been care, community care, especially in the advocacy space, acknowledging all the incredible work that we've done this far and how far we've come, and also the gathering of various skills, strengths and talents together, and working together in solidarity in times such as this for mutual aid and sharing those resources and being there for one another. And also I've had the privilege of time to reflect on myself. I'm someone who's been living financially independently and alone for the past 3 years now, and during COVID, so it was self-isolating by myself for 2 months solid. And so, yeah, applying the same love that I give to others in the advocacy space, and as a youth worker to myself, which has been a really lovely experiencing to time. And yeah, it's really lovely to speak to you and see you all here.
Great, thanks Harpreet. It's actually a really good segue to say we are joined by about 200 people online, or more than actually 200 people online right now, but also from all sectors have over 400 people who are likely to jump on, from government to NGO to overseas. So it's going to be really exciting to get questions from all those sectors. And welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. So thank you for sharing a little bit about yourself. I'm sure we're going to get to know more about you in the next hour and a bit. I want to start off with a general overview. And also going off some of your reflections, we've been hearing about the new normal in various contexts, whether that's during COVID-19 or after, so there's a bit of both. I might start with Swathi and Butrus. What does transition back to normal look like? How do we redefine our new normal?
Butrus, did you want to go first?
Ladies first.
Fair enough.
I might pass it to you, Swathi. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a really fun question because it's just the topic of now, isn't it? Like everyone wants to jump to talking about what is the new normal, what do things look like, and it's a really exciting thing. But to me, it's actually been quite terrifying, to be honest. I suppose I take some sort of a more skeptical view on this, coming out. Sort of being at the stage of my life where I'm sort of finishing being a young person almost, even though some people say that can go up until you're 30, which would be wonderful. But so in addition to a lot of the work that I'm doing, I'm also a young carer to a family member with a mental illness, and I work and I manage all of my personal affairs as well. And I think that being in that stage of being in the youth category at the moment and listening to a lot of the politics that's going on, and a lot of the rhetoric that's coming through from politicians during this time has kind of almost shrouded a lot of this time in a lot of uncertainty and a lot more heightened sense of fear, I suppose, than was necessary. We keep hearing these messages that we're all meant to be in this together and that somehow we're all affected by this equally, and I just don't believe that's true. And to me, a new transition back to the new normal is a very long road. I don't really see it as something that happens immediately. I don't think that there's a timeline that we can put on this, and we've seen that now with all of those people in with me who are back in lockdown at the moment are especially feeling that, I know. So I think I don't really see it clearly as yet, and I think that reflects a lot of the uncertainty and a lot of the fear that people in my age group really hold. There's no clear path, and the government also wants to play politics with our futures. Like they want to raise HEX fees on certain courses, and we don't really know what supports are going to be available because a lot of budgets haven't been finalised yet. So to me, I'm really terrified. I join in with people who are really terrified. I understand it, and yeah, I think it's just going to be a long ongoing process. Yeah,
no, that's a lot actually that you've captured, Swathi, in your response, which I'll talk to in a second. But Butrus, yourself, what does transition back to normal look like for you?
I think for me, the new normal just basically means we're reflecting on things we probably have neglected or forgot in the past. In a joking manner, I always say the 1.5 meter distance. Well, I don't really want anybody that I don't know that close to me. So I'm glad that that's in-house, and that's a new normal for us. Or when you get the restaurants who say we clean, and I'm like, isn't that what you're supposed to really do? So I guess we're really reflecting on things that we've really neglected in the past. And for me, COVID's given us time to kind of reflect on society, reflect on the ugly truth sometimes, the inequality, the bias, the minority groups, and all those other things. So the new norm is kind of acknowledging where we've kind of gone wrong and where we've kind of overlooked and how we can change that into the future. It's gotten us to sit in a place where we've been in our homes and reflected on a lot of things that society's kind of overlooked. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of almost a new chapter of what we've overlooked and how we can eventually change that, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's been an incredibly reflective time for many people, and not just individuals, but institutions. I hope I'm using this as a as a reflection. What about, sorry, Zahra, and I'm just going to move to Zahra and Harpreet. What is your hope for a post-pandemic world, and how do we go about achieving it as individuals and as organizations?
That's a very hard question, Meg. I think that I don't want to transition at all. I just want a new clean slate. If a whole pandemic can bring the Australian community together, why can't a healthy community bring us all together? So for me, I think that if we're reflecting upon the federal government's actions right now, we've received a $50 million mental health fund for during post-COVID. So I think what it looks like to me is that more young people or the Australian wider community can together work to build the world, a better Australia post-COVID.
Yeah.
And if we're speaking about what I want and what the Australian community needs, I think that it is that unity and it is that bond to continue and to perpetually continue. I think that it is rather important to continue to strive for unity as opposed to everything. We need to continue to work together. And look, if the one positive thing that COVID has brought for us, and I think that it's been reflected across all industries, is that we've seen a lot more voices that have been neglected within the Australian communities. For example, we've seen webinars like this take place, which have united migrants, refugees, people with intersectional identities. And this is so incredibly important to persevere in the future. I think that we must continue to work together and to highlight the voices that have been neglected. So I guess unity must prevail after this all, and I don't want to transition.
Yeah,
with a new clean slate.
Absolutely, something to take with us to the post-pandemic world. Thank you, Harpreet.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Zahra. It's a tricky question for sure, and it's something that we all need to think about it and sit with the discomfort of it, because there is a whole level of injustices and class struggles and like inequality and exploitation of workers, and that's going on in Australia, and especially with what's going on behind closed doors and the lack of data that we have, especially to the information to, I guess, with like domestic violence, family violence, alcohol and drug abuse during this period as well has been something that's been quite alarming. That's been a lot with young people. And definitely representation for me is something that I like to see post-COVID-19. Having platforms such as this and having the opportunities and the connections, and as well as refugees and migrants having to not fight with each other for these opportunities and this representation and work together, and not having it to be like filling up a quota, but like having it be, diversity is completely key. And that's how we're going to have our policies. If we have a diverse representation in who we elect as like politicians, we have diverse-led experiences, and we also are able to see, I guess, in this period, those who, like, there's like a regain of passion, and there's a regain of use of like social media as a digital advocacy, and people fighting for Black Lives Matter and climate justice, sorry. And also, just we need more than ever to stay together, and having the new normal be something that's ever changing and adaptable, because we never know what's going to happen this time next year. And so it's something that we need to be sustaining our energy, putting ourselves first, giving us that love of time of day, and then also looking out for each other rather than for ourselves, especially with the toilet paper incident at the very beginning of COVID to now with the mutual aid support groups, just how vital that has been for so many people's lives. I think, that is the new normal. We can't be egocentric anymore. We need to.
Absolutely. I think the kind of thing I've got from hearing from most of you, the theme that I've got is We've seen all the inequalities that we've been talking about for a long time, but they've really come to the surface through this experience. And we can't take that post-COVID. We can't even take it right now. Like there has to be an addressing of the inequalities that are coming to the surface for everyone else to see now, but we've been highlighting for a while. And that the unity and mutual support has to be carried forward. Like it can't just be in a crisis time. You know, the unity of coming together and supporting each other is something that should be part of the society or the fabric of it. Thank you for sharing those initial kind of experiences. Earlier this year, as you may have known in the audience, but all of you are involved in, we ran a video project. So MYAN Australia ran a video project to amplify the experiences of young people from a migrant and refugee background. We also ran a couple of focus groups, which you were all part of. And in those videos, we understood that some of the most pressing challenges for young people at that time, which was about a month ago or 2 months and a half, for young people are education, employment, and mental health. So we will sort of focus on those 3 areas for today's conversation. But let's start with the education systems, particularly primary and secondary schools, or primary and secondary education has been disrupted during COVID-19. I'm wondering, Butrus, if you can kick us off, what do you think has been the impact of this disruption, or we're still having it, on migrant refugee young people and their families?
I think the COVID has really shown the different standards of education in primary and secondary school. For example, during the online schooling, I was mentoring and looking after some of my younger cousins while they were doing online schooling. And the differences between certain schools has got technology and they've got softwares ready to go for students to use, and other schools who kind of go through emails and whatever they can kind of get past. So there was a massive difference in standards of education. Now, that 5-week period could make a massive difference in a child's life who's probably already struggling. They're probably already learn English is already a second language. They need the extra help. That time to study at home has probably slowed down their education progression pretty much. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of highlighted that we need a standard level of education, and that includes technology as well. Within all schools, certain schools couldn't afford to give all kids technology to use at home, and certain kids couldn't afford technology at home. So it highlighted that. It also highlighted the struggle of not involving parents in their kids' education as well. I'm especially talking about migrant and refugee parents. So certain parents didn't understand what they could do in homeschooling, and they did not know how to support, not because they don't want to, but they are unsure. They haven't been part of the process. They haven't been involved in these kind of conversations. So then when it was up to them to take over the education system, it was a struggle. And then taking into consideration, you've got other younger siblings, you've got maybe older parents that you've got to look after. Now the kid is struggling at home, and then when they come after 5 weeks, the teachers go, "Oh, you haven't really done the work." But they didn't really understand the situations and the circumstances the child is involved at home. So it really showed just the imbalance, especially within the migrant and refugee kids in the education space.
Yeah, it sounds as almost like ripple effects or compounding effects of not being able to engage the students at school in the same way, or in education. And we'll talk a little bit more about education, but I'm also interested to hear from Harpreet and Zahra. You're both studying in tertiary education or tertiary courses. And we know that university students have also been affected. How so have they been affected, and what's being done to support them? Or what can be done to support them as well?
Yeah, definitely. You can see it on a whole range of levels as well. You can see it through the international students being affected by the increases and accommodation, and you can also see it and just with the job seeker and all this government payments. And you can also see it through, I guess, like the university fee hikes and cuts to courses with at the moment something around like 113% increase with the arts for those who are studying arts degrees. And that's me. I'll be affected by that immensely. and just pretty much the cut to the casual staff, teachers and whole departments as well. Teaching makes a difference in a student's life, and if we are cutting and if we're overwhelming the life of a teacher, it then reflects and it just disrupts the life of a student and their learning and making the most of university, though all this is happening as well. And a lot of it is issues with accessibility as well, and having that that financial accessibility, yeah, as well as like with mental health and therapy, like these private institutions, like having therapy sessions being around like $200 for 1 hour, and most people can't afford that during this time. And it's that kind of, with it's tricky with the 5 plan a session, but yeah, there's a lot that needs to be done, and definitely with university students, we are at the brunt, and as well as for the upcoming high school students having like gone through like in the HSC year this, and now having to have a whole other sets of barriers in front of them.
Yeah, that transition as well, I think is, I've been hearing a lot of VCs. I know the Victorian system of last year of school transitioning into university has been a big conversation, at least in some of the circles I'm part of. Zahra, what about you? Like, you're also connected to tertiary institutions. What has been the disruption you've seen, and what can be done to support?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly highlight a point that Harpreet mentioned, which will obviously later on be discussed a lot more. But Harpreet did mention the rise in humanities courses, and I did want to touch on that briefly because unfortunately, people who will be impacted by this rise are students coming from low socioeconomic suburbs or low socioeconomic regions. And it is important to decipher that there is a high density of new migrants and refugees within these areas. So if we look at it statistically, the increase in humanities courses will predominantly affect new migrants and refugees. So unfortunately, that's another barrier that COVID-19 has impacted the migrant and refugee community. In terms of university and what university has supported or what it has done, I think that it is rather important to note that teaching online means that you can't really see the struggles and the barriers that students are going through. And COVID-19 has certainly excavated the margins of the barriers that we are enduring at the moment. So if you have issues that are increasing and you have a lack of communication to actually witness the issues that are increasing, unfortunately, there's no win-win solution. It's a lose-lose solution. Not even a solution, it's a lose-lose
situation.
Absolutely, that's the word that I needed. But fortunately for me, my university has been absolutely amazing. I have seen empathy being placed at the core of our values of our university. We've had long-term funds that have been increased, such as a $100 technology stipend to help students. We've had digital support, such as laptops and computers that can be taken home. We've had international support, such as food vouchers given. And I think that what this shows students is that COVID-19 means that students are deserving of long-term support, not just short-term support. And unfortunately, if organizations are giving short-term support, more often than not, this will actually lead to larger barriers that students go through, because you are unfortunately placed in a situation where you're comfortable with the situation that you are currently in. And unfortunately, you can't be comfortable during COVID-19, especially with the abundance of barriers that are being placed within our lives. So what I've seen at my university is long-term ongoing empathetic support, which is absolutely incredible. And I think this must be reflected across all industries. So if there's one thing I can push to all industries, I think let's start being a bit more empathetic and realize that many of the issues that young people are going through right now, you can't see through a computer, you can't see through an email. It has to be done through a conversation.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important point. I think people often feel like empathy is just an individual action, but it can be embedded in our systems, in how we engage with populations around us and our client base, if you want to use technical terms, but really the people that are most affected by our decisions. Thank you for that, Zahra. You briefly mentioned digital learning, or like learning online, and the one thing that's been highlighted in this time is digital learning and its future. So Swathi, I'm curious to hear from you. What are some opportunities that digital learning has brought for you and your community? Like, what do you want us to keep versus what should not stay in terms of digital learning?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I keep going with this, I also want to acknowledge any teachers, anyone who works in the education space, anyone who supports young people to do their homework, to encourage them to stay in school, to encourage them to learn and stay engaged, because it is very much needed right now. And taking a perspective of working in an organisation that has the capacity to impact the lives of young people at a very pivotal stage of their life, during a very difficult stage of their life, I think it is so important to acknowledge those efforts, but also to recognise how hard a lot of staff who are either on this call but also out there in the world would have had to pivot to support those young people during this time. And I think one of the key lessons is, as hard as online learning is, it's also opened up a certain world of opportunity for people who either may not have been able to access certain learning opportunities before, but what it's also done is it's forced a lot of people, whether it be education providers or whether it be companies or different people who create educational products, to really force themselves to innovate and see what kinds of ways they can make that content accessible to people across the board. So absolutely, we have pre-existing inequalities where people have poor access to things like internet connection, basic technological resources. And I think that when we're talking about this transition to online learning, we also need to remember that COVID-19 forced us to shut down a lot of public spaces. And what that has meant is that when they had to close tertiary institutions, when we had to close our public libraries, a lot of young people lost the key areas that they had to study, the safe spaces that they had to study, because you're either at home with like 6 or 7 siblings, or you've got really loud family, or maybe those young people are in a situation where they have a very layered identity, where they could be carers or they could be caring for their siblings, which of course is an added layer. And then going home to study or to do your work sometimes isn't the best way to help you navigate going forward. So online learning has created a world of opportunity for people who might not have been able to access things before. And it's really forced us to think about how we're going to keep this going into the future. My thinking is that we need to consider having a blended model where we have this online learning still available. Because what it does is, for people who do have those layered identities, for young people with disabilities, for young people who are caring for someone with a disability, especially if you're from a refugee and migrant background, you're navigating that role of being a cultural navigator, but also, you have all of these other things that, like Zahra very beautifully said, that you don't know what's going on with a young person if you don't ask them, or if you don't see them, or if you're not meaningfully engaging with them. And earlier this year, when COVID-19 just started to kick in and we just went into isolation, I had the really lovely opportunity to run a youth-led project with some young people, and it was the first one we did online. I started in my role and I had to run a youth-led project online. I was like, this is just not going to go well. They're not going to listen to me, and they're going to be bored out of their minds. And it ended up being really beautiful, because it was just a beautiful opportunity to connect with them and to hang out. And they ended up creating a video diary about their experiences as COVID-19 began. And a lot of them were from a different range of age groups. We had a high school student and we had university students. And what I learned from that experience was, one, the transition to online learning isn't perfect. Every student learns differently, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this. All of the orgs out there who are working really hard to keep young people engaged need to keep going, keep pivoting, and don't expect this to be a short-term thing. I think that everyone who's doing this work needs to see how they can build in supports and how they're supporting their staff and upskilling everyone to support those young people into the long term. And then when we were working with some of the young people who were in kind of in the older bracket, moving into employment from tertiary education, there was a lot of, we had the opportunity to talk about how we could help them find employment and how can we support that transition. And I think part of that pivoting has seen how can we continue to engage and support those young people in all of the issues that we can't see, like Zahra was saying, and finding opportunities to embed more and more engagement and learning and safe sort of options for young people to come back to. I think that's one of the most important things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've alluded to something really important, and that's access is not necessarily just just being able to go online, but there's a whole range of supports that go around it. It's not just a put everything online and everything will work. It's very much what else goes with it. And so that holistic approach is what we need to be looking at as organizations or as people who work with young people. How do we holistically support and make it accessible, especially whether it's digital learning or whether it's getting their voices on decision-making tables. You've also alluded to that additional to education, we've also seen an interruption of young people's pathways and careers, whether it's employment or entrepreneurship or graduate programs, everything seems to have some sort of interruption. And Swathi, just continuing from what you're saying, what do you think needs to be done now to minimize the impact of this change in employment pathways or career pathways?
We need to employ and pay educational staff more. And when I say that quite broadly, because it's not just teachers. Often schools have embedded supports like a careers outreach person, and it's usually like this one, more often than not, lady, but also shout out to everyone who works in that role, who works part-time and is usually hella over-resourced. I've been doing outreach work as part of some other programs, reaching out to a lot of schools during this crazy, crazy time. And it's really taught me that the careers pathway person, or whatever title they're given in the school, are very under-resourced and overworked, and God bless them. They need more funding, basically. If you want young people to be well supported, you need to resource those schools, the support services really well. And when we talk about embedding holistic approaches or looking at things holistically, we also need to make sure that a lot of those support organisations who have come out of not necessarily come out of the woodworks, but been given more recognition as a result of the increasing inequalities that we're talking about. And they've been doing incredible work. Like we've seen here with a lot of the housing towers that have been locked down, all of these community organisations and young leaders came out and did work within a matter of hours that a lot of government agencies weren't able to so rapidly respond to. But they've recognised that and they've thanked that. And I'm saying that needs to be backed by money. If there are great young people in your communities right now that you know about that are already doing work like supporting young people, those young people should be employed to do that. They should continue to be employed to do that. If there are young people who are studying in those pathways and they know that they want to support, they want to be in careers, like they want to be a psychologist, they want to serve their community in one way or another, we need to actually show them that there's a pathway to do that, that we're willing to invest in their futures, and that we're willing to systemically correct a lot of the issues that we know have been pre-existing. And I say that because right now there's this ongoing conversation about the racism within big institutions, and the way that we've structured managerial positions to be what we realise, or what we've always known, were probably mostly white appearing people or white people. And now, like we saw the recent news with SBS and a lot of major organisations that we know are meant to represent the lives of diverse young people, and they're not necessarily diverse. So organisations who might be seriously questioning how they're doing work, and whether or not they're actually, how they're going to keep doing their work into the future, keep asking the hard questions, empower your young people to ask those questions and support them to do that, and create safe and meaningful opportunities for them to do so. And when you're pivoting, actually implement a lot of those changes, like implement employment pathways programs, upskill your young people, throw them into different positions, give them those crazy opportunities. Because the one thing I've learned from spaces like this, from working with young people, like all of the young people on this panel today, is that like the change that you see is really, really inspiring. And I think before I got involved in work like this, I didn't really see incredible brown women like Mehak, like Harpreet, or incredible people like Butrus or Zahra. And not only inspiring, but it's almost like a sustenance to keep going and to keep doing things. And that's probably what's kept me going. It's given me a lot of hope during this time. And I think that into the future, that's what organisations need to rely on, the energy, the skill and the insight of their young people.
Absolutely. And the idea of embedding them within all layers, so not just like a whole group of young facilitators that are all people of color or BIPOC, and then that doesn't sort of flow through the rest of the organization, I think is something that I got from what you said. Just wanted to quickly highlight, if we can definitely, or I can see your comments in the audience coming through, and thank you for sharing your experiences as well in those comments. But just if you've joined us and you want to put in a question, make sure you put it in the Q&A box, because that's what we will be looking at in about another 20 minutes or so. So yes, just make sure you put your questions in the Q&A box, and if you have comments or you have tech issues, put that in the chat box. Sorry, just continuing on, Butrus, I'm again curious to hear from you more broadly. What do you think young people need for their employment journey? So Swathi's highlighted some of the stuff to minimize impact and going forward into COVID-19, but what about that journey? What do you think young people need?
I think to highlight what Swathi has said, speaking about employment pathway, I think that's very important. As you can tell with the pandemic, there's been a change in demands in the industry. There's been a change in the workforce. It's important to have those pathway conversations and to highlight the change, to highlight that certain industries might be in demand in the next 5 years and certain industries might not be. And maybe restructure that career pathway conversation that schools generally have. Because I know a lot of students, they're focused on their goals and what they want to achieve and what they want to study in uni. But if they don't have that honest conversation about maybe where you're gone, the industry might be really tough or the industry might be struggling. I guess these are the very important conversations to have with students in order for them to understand the demand, I guess, and where it's at, and especially with how we're moving forward into technology and the use of technology and entrepreneurs and business owners and stuff like that. And so instead of just the focus on the standard kind of job, I think those career pathway conversations and more investment, like Swathi said, into those career counselors, I think they're called, I'm not too sure the technical term, more investment into them, and widely encouraging young people, and especially people from migrant backgrounds and stuff like that, of the opportunities that are available instead of the standard stuff that we always look at kind of situation. Yes,
no, for sure. And Harpreet and Zahra, do you have anything you want to add to Butrus and Swathi's comments about employment journeys or employment pathways?
I think, yeah, one quick thing is just access to information and access to, I guess, having those opportunities. I guess the main ways for me, the main way of me getting employment, and like, because I didn't do so well in high school, was through doing advocacy and having that, being a part, doing that volunteering. And I guess, but also having employment be, having there to be less unpaid work. And if it's a work that you can pay a migrant or refugee for doing that work, that'll be very, very much, it'll boost the work ethic and the, I guess, the validation, that affirmation of what they're doing is valuable.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, I know we're running short on time, but I just want to quickly add to that. That is very true. Whether it be translation work, whether it be like a quick consultation, whether it be asking a young person for feedback on your program, I think more often than not, especially in this sector, there's a tendency for some people to say, I don't have a lot of money, or it's just a quick conversation and they won't mind. And young people, especially emerging young leaders, are of course so willing, so passionate to give their time. But you absolutely need to value that time, that knowledge and that expertise with either money or some sort of opportunity to meaningfully reimburse their time. Not only does it say that you take them seriously, but you're obviously going to go back and use that knowledge for something else. But one of the most powerful things that someone taught me in youth engagement was that, young people are the experts of their own lives. You're consulting an expert for something, you need to back them with that. but I can guarantee you that it does translate into a life skill that will teach them something really, really valuable. I know that when I was up and coming as a law student, many times I've just like given away free translating services off the bat. And then I think later on what it taught me was just that at some points that skill was actually really, really valuable, and whether or not I was taken advantage of at some points and whether or not I should have spoken up for myself. And so if we're talking about meaningful engagement and really reinforcing and backing young people, we need to be injecting those lessons and those supports that we know now at every opportunity that we can, because this is an uncertain future and there's going to be a lot more problems that are amplified that they're going to have to navigate.
Yeah, no, thank you for highlighting that. Harpreet, did you want to quickly say something?
Yeah, definitely. I just want to quickly add, like, nurturing young passion, definitely, and also preventing burnt out culture.
Yeah.
Is important. And I think that links with like mental health. And very quickly wanted to add, yeah, just the necessary of them be many languages when it comes to promoting like job opportunities, or have it information be more accessible to be more in more languages than English.
Yeah.
Languages, and English is very much a colonial language.
Yeah, yeah, and you can, and inclusive practices means that you can make things accessible in terms of rating as well. I know I have an experience of when we first came to Australia. I was lucky; my parents, knew how to navigate the system or figured it out and Googled their way through a lot of things. But stuff like not knowing, what is the key selection criteria, that pushed us so much further than people who already knew that thing or that knowledge. And then as a young person, you're not told any of that stuff in school. You're not prepared for any of it. So I think, Butrus, you also highlighted, like, how do we really financially back career pathway advisors so they can truly invest in students as they transition and give them all the skills. But surely key selection criteria is not the only way to get jobs. Like, surely we can think of more ways to allow people to be financially independent and sustained. So I'm trying to keep us on time, so I'm going to move us through to the next topic. And thank you again. I can see the questions coming through, so we'll look at them very shortly. But now moving to, I suppose, young people's well-being and mental health. We've seen an investment in youth mental health or generally mental health and support from governments. We've seen a greater recognition of its importance in the wider community. Zahra and Butrus, do you think the investment and recognition has reached young people from migrant and refugee backgrounds? And if yes, how has it been effective? If no, why has it not reached?
Thanks, Mehak. I think, first of all, we need to highlight that there is no new data concerning young migrants and refugees within the mental health space. And that within itself raises an alarming question as to whether this funding will actually reach migrant and refugee communities. I'm sure we're all aware of the stigma that is surrounding mental health within migrant and refugee communities. And unfortunately, I've done my research and there's no new data surrounding the issues of stigma, taboo within mental health specifically. We've spoken previously about how COVID-19 is a long-term issue. And unfortunately, what I have seen within many mental health organizations is that mental health support comes in short-term solutions. And unfortunately, we've also seen COVID-19 expand the disparities that are prevalent within mental health. So if we're providing short-term mental health solutions, unfortunately, I don't think that that is actually going to be very effective. So what I personally think is that if this funding is to come through and if this funding is to actually make the desired change that it is aiming to achieve, we must ensure that young migrants and refugees are not only structuring the plans of how this funding will be used, but we are also collecting data post implementation of these strategies. Otherwise, we've kind of got a lack of information as to what we can do in the future. And we've kind of got programs that are being introduced with no data backing it up, which will ultimately lead to a never-ending circle of programs that are introduced but actually won't create that change. So My only recommendation is that if we are to actually create successful change within the migrant and refugee mental health community and issue, we must ensure that migrants and refugees are actually shaping that change, because we know ourselves the best. And Swathi did mention there are intersectional identities that we do hold. And these intersectional identities must be recognized within the strategy of applying this mental health strategies in the future. Pass it on to Butrus.
Great, thanks so much.
Thanks, Zahra. Firstly, I think it's fantastic with the amount of funding that is gone into the mental health, and that is recognised as a major problem. But to saying it's reaching the right people, especially young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds, I would say no. And to answer that, I think the Multicultural Youth Council, we had a discussion previously a while ago about how fundings is structured to one big service group, and that service group might not have the right framework for people from refugees and migrant backgrounds. And we had a discussion about why. And some of the conversation was around whether the services and the spaces fit people from refugee and migrant backgrounds, whether they understood the cultural stigma in coming in and seeking service, whether the hubs actually involved activities or things that refugee and migrant youth would actually go into. And a lot of it was no, it was for mainstream. And even if you see things like posters and stuff like that, like we all need help and, you know, come seek help. But if you don't see yourself in there and you don't see representation, and that's the biggest thing, representation. If I don't see me, I'm not going to go get some help out there. I think representation is a massive thing, even in our posters, even in the information we share, the wordings and things like that. And even the stigma of how information about seeking help is represented. You're not a bad person that you're seeking help. You know, this is a conversation. This is a place for support. And unfortunately, because there is lack of representation in those areas, those frameworks haven't actually been changed. And like Zahra said, with no research, as it is, it doesn't show the lack of refugee and migrants seeking support in those services. So it looks like, you know, we're doing well. We've got this many people coming through, but how many of them are refugee and migrant background seeking help? So I think representation is very important. Co-facilitating is very important. And Swathi mentioned it, talking to the experts. The experts are the young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds. And I think it's also ownership on us who are young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds to get into those places. I'm currently studying psychology for that reason, because if I want to help young men like myself, they need to be able to have someone that they could reach out to and have a conversation. They need to be able to step in an office and see someone that looks like them, that tells them that it is okay not to be okay. And I think that's very important.
Absolutely. Harpreet, I know you wanted to say something? Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add, it's very important to break the taboo, the shame, the stigma, and the silences of mental health of ourselves, and just as well the stereotypes that exist towards it. I am someone who lives with PTSD, ADHD, and depression, and mainly so many people have all these thoughts of very like negative stereotypes to what it is, and not pretty much think have a viewpoint of seeing it as something that can, when having that mental therapy, it supports the work that I'm doing now, because I have that level of empathy from that mental health. And so really pretty much, I guess, destroying and getting rid of, like, a new normal should be the mental health, and like our mental health, and acknowledging the disorders that we have. It shouldn't be something that people should fear someone else for having.
Yeah.
As well as really quickly, just like intergenerational trauma as well, and like those closest to someone are like most likely the ones that telling them to not get therapy, and especially with like coming from like generations of parents where they themselves haven't had therapy, and so it's like a cycle, and like just breaking that chain, that cycle.
Yeah.
Like
Absolutely. I think breaking that cycle and you've all highlighted something really critical. I too studied psychology for some of that reason of, you know, you can't actually be what you can't. Like if there's a therapist that I go to and she doesn't, or he or they don't understand the nuances that I come with, they're not going to be able to respond in the same way because they don't get it. And you instead spend more time educating a therapist about the nuances than actually dealing with the situation. Swathi, one of the responses around mental health has been, we are all in this together, or the rhetoric and the campaign around we're all in this together. Do you feel like young people connected to this? What's been the vibe on the ground from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful, warm, cuddly message if you want it to be, isn't it? I think the great equalizer with COVID-19, as we've seen, is that like basically anyone can get sick and it's terrifying. But this message that we're all in this together has a big unless you are someone on a temporary protection visa, unless you are someone on who doesn't have connection to any other supports, unless you are someone who speaks a language other than English, unless you are someone who has a disability or any other disadvantage. I think that a lot of people are quite angry at this time, and those are the people who have already been suffering for a number of reasons. And I won't harp on about it because we've mentioned it quite a few times, but I think what does need to be said is that I don't think we should let people, and when I say people, I mean people in positions of power, people at systemic levels who have the power to create change. I don't think we should let them forget a lot of the problems that existed before and say, oh, this isn't something that you just discovered now. I've been going through this for a hell of a long time. I think this is the time to really hammer that home and to really not let people forget the experiences or the people that have really been left behind. And I think we also need to remember when it comes to, when we're talking about mental health and we're all in this together, there is a very large contingent of asylum seekers. Like I said, a lot of people who have been left out of supports, critical supports during this time. And now with, of course, what's been quite popular around the world, Melbourne implementing the mask rule, it highlights again quite quickly as well, kind of highlights exactly what supports people have access to. And of course, a lot of people like international students, a lot of asylum seekers, anyone who's on those sorts of temporary visas, don't have access to any sort of government support and are really relying on literally the charity of different organisations, community leaders, and people who have been willing to step up and share their resources. So, and we also need to remember that those people don't have access to things like paid healthcare and to things like mental health care support. Those are usually the things that are last on the list. And we often rely on this message of, I think when you talk about the refugee and migrant cohort, there's this blanket sort of identity where you're a lot more resilient, so they can just get on with it, all because their cultures have always been so resistant to change that they can just get on with it. That's not true, that's not accurate, that's not correct, and we shouldn't continue to accept it.
Yeah.
I talk about the things that I do and do the work that I do because of the lived experiences that I have and that my family has with mental health. If I am at all exceptional in some way, it's because my family is exceptional in the experiences that they have gone through. And I've never really believed that we're all in this together, even before this message came out. You know, as I grew up in a family that's dealt with mental illness and coming from an Indian Tamil migrant background, it was just something that's not talked about, that's not dealt with. And now being older in a position where I'm working and where I'm taking on more responsibilities, whether it be in my professional life, personal life, in my community, or just for my family, what it's really showed to me, especially being in isolation for the past few months, is a real sense of loneliness and a need to take things into your own hands. So talk about resilience and being in this together, what I've seen is that it's the young people that are really promoting that message. So I think that's a really, really big positive to come out of it. But I will say that there's a lot of work to be done to make that message stick and make it really meaningful. And it does rely on us taking things into our own hands. So we can criticize messages as much as we want, but I see it as an opportunity as much as I see the gaps and the work that needs to be done. a lot of that investment was only going to go into the right places if we partner with communities and we invest in our young leaders and we really rely on the expertise that we keep talking about from our young people. And for me, like I've been to university, I've worked in jobs, I've had a lot of professional experiences, but the advocacy skills and the confidence to talk about things and go into different spaces with people in positions of power and really ask for change for the hard things and asking the hard questions. All of those skills have come from watching other young leaders who look like me and seeing other young leaders who look like me, and then having the confidence to then reach out and to exist within these spaces. I think we all know that those are protests in and of themselves. It's a great thing to do. It's so inspiring. And to me, that's what's going to make that message stick.
Yeah, that was actually really beautifully captured. I almost don't feel like I want to add anything to it because I feel like I'll dilute it, but thank you for covering all that stuff. Harpreet, just a really quick positive spin before we move to audience Q&A. We saw you highlight mental health in your COVID-19 experience video about a month ago. What have you been doing to positively influence your mental health and well-being?
Definitely. I have been working on like my story and acknowledging my whole story and doing a lot of self-reflection. And I've also been doing like virtual like yoga classes with friends and like encouraging each other to do exercises. And also, yeah, being very much caring with the workload that's on my plate and trying to, yeah, pretty much be better organized with what I have due tomorrow, not just like do all last minute energy. And yeah.
I think, well, thank you. I think it's important to kind of share some of those strategies because we all kind of learn from each other and pick some of those things while we're highlighting what's not working and what needs to be done more of. I think it's also as important to recognize that this is a time where we need to sometimes slow down and move away from our screens and do the virtual yoga class or what I recently saw, virtual goat yoga as well. I don't know how that works, but that's for another time. Thank you. We're just given time, we're moving on to sort of our Q&A from our audience, which I'm excited to read in a second. Quickly to remind everyone, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A box and I'm going to start sifting through those. Thank you all of you for providing such insightful reflections and responses so far. So the way this will work is I'll read about 5 to 6 questions, and unless there's anything that's directed specifically to any panelist, some questions may be missed, and that's a time limitation and restriction. Also, I will sift through some of the questions to see that we can pick the ones that haven't been necessarily responded to. So if you give me 1 second, let's see what I've got first. I think this is a good one to just start with generally. What do young people need from Deb from TAFE New South Wales? What do young people need from education and the training sector to help recover from COVID? We've kind of answered that, but I'm wondering if anyone has any other dot points that they want to share. For young people to recover from COVID-19 in education and training.
I'm just going to add a really basic point, which is I think, especially for a lot of the people who are working in sort of the support organisations or organisations that work in like youth engagement and running programs, is to just work on being that safe space. We're talking about young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds, and they're probably going to be engaging with your programs for any number of reasons that you're not going to directly know, whether it be like to build life skills, it could be to practice English, it could just be to get away from their families or just to spend some time with other people, it could just be something as simple as making friends. And if we're talking about connecting that with education, I think that because this is such a difficult time and we know this is going to keep going on into the future, we need to focus on what value we're adding to their lives and what value we're adding to that time, and how we can embed different supports into the spaces that we are creating. Because like Zahra said before, we don't know what's going on in a young person's life immediately, and online learning can kind of reduce that experience, but it also increases our level of engagement and opens up a new world of opportunities. So I think we need to force ourselves to really, when we're pivoting, be really creative and see what we can inject into everything we have.
Absolutely. It takes a bit of risk to do that as well. Like you don't really know what happens on the other side, but you take a bit of a risk to create and innovate your response for sure.
Yeah, I'd like to add, working together, I think having meetings and meeting with each other to understand, or like on Zoom, for example, to understand, I guess, the barriers for each and what each would like to have. Because it'll be that having that dialogue and working with one another, I feel like it's very important.
Cool. Thanks, Harpreet. Another one that I've picked up is from Tanaya Joshi. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, but the question is, considering that the space of policy change, and I'm going to add a little bit of that advocacy maybe as well, is incredibly wide, how do we as migrant refugee youth access those spaces to make change for the better? Is it better to work from inside the system or outside of the system? And I have my own sort of response to this, but I might open it up to one of you first. Zahra, have you got any thoughts on that? Should we work inside a system or outside a system?
I think both, Mehak. I think you can't really create that change until you have exposure within both systems, and when you can actually decipher and recognize where the issues are deriving upon, what's going on within both systems. Sometimes you've got to be in that uncomfortable situation to actually recognize where the inequalities are coming from. And sometimes I as much as I don't want to say persevere within these mainly white organizations or areas, sometimes you've just got to, because we really need to ensure that we have a high representation within these systems. And sometimes it is that one voice that does create that change, and it is that one voice that just does create perspective. Unfortunately, I think that sometimes it's a hit or miss. So it really is about having those uncomfortable situations. But then again, I just want to quickly relate it back to Black Lives Matter movement. We can't always ask the Black or Indigenous friends to educate us. Similarly, within these institutions or within these areas, we can't just expect one person of color to educate a whole system that is inherently racist. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Mehak, because I don't really have that much experience within these sectors, but I think you've just got to jump in and take every opportunity, but don't always lose the energy and to try and win that battle.
Yeah, for sure. Swathi?
I was just going to say, speaking to friends who both work in government, who work outside of government, who work in various, who are now going into work in those various environments, a lot of the message that you get back is like, I'm like the only person of colour in this entire team, and having really freaked out conversations about that. And look, that's going to change, and we need to commend those young people for being really brave and taking up those spaces. Really encouraging those young leaders is one thing, but I think the one saying that comes to mind is, you know, when the door you've been knocking on swings open, don't walk, run through it. And we need to be doing everything we can to teach young people to either run through those doors or knock them the hell down.
Yeah, for sure. I think my, honestly, like my reflections come from very, very many different areas of my work as well, in advocacy and in social entrepreneurship, and not-for-profit government. But I think, I personally think it's a bit of both, like you're inside systems, but also outside systems. And when we're inside systems, we're not just, again, like I said, at the sort of service delivery phase, which is important because the people who come to see the services and programs get to interact with people, but we're also embedded throughout. You know, we're leading the work, we're involved in the strategy design, and I think, Zahra, you mentioned that one person, one voice can make a difference. While I agree, I think it can be incredibly difficult to carry it by yourself. Like it's a lot of emotional labor to be the only person, you know, in that organization, for example, to be pushing for a certain perspective. So I think we need to think about that as we hire people. It's like not that one person of color that's made a difference to the team. Alternatively, I think it's creating systems. Like I could talk quickly about what MYAN does. You know, we have three sort of networks that really inform and direct our work. And one is the Youth Ambassadors Network, such that some of you are part of, that we go to for whether it's advice or opportunities like this, like they inform a lot of the direction that we take. So having some of those networks that are really embedded in your system, I think makes a difference. Even though they're not internal necessarily, they're external, but they influence. I, though, for example, personally, I'm an infiltrator. I'm like, I'm going to come into the system and change it.
Yeah.
Cool.
Sorry, Mehak, I'm just going to add one more thing. I think there's also just a really interesting point to make here about just with the BIPOC movement and with what's happening with Black Lives Matters and the fact that a lot of organisations, if they're funded different, depending on who they're funded by, might be a bit scared to speak up on certain topics. And I think that this is a time when we need to be listening to people who are speaking up about whatever inequalities it is that they're experiencing. People do see colour no matter what background you come from. I've personally experienced that working with people from the healthcare sector for all my life. Even now, if I'm going to navigate a service for a loved one who needs care, people have often been surprised at the level of skill I have in speaking English. And that's the question they ask me instead of how can I help you? So I think we just need to remember that this is a time where people are trying to be really radical and we need to support those spaces.
Absolutely.
I might just add 2 cents into it.
Sure.
I truly believe, I think the inside should represent the outside. So both ways are very important. I think it's important that our politician or parties or whatever reflect society in order for us to have a true change, policies that actually reflect everybody in society. So I think importantly, it's to encourage young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds to do get into politics, do get into these positions in order to make change, and not just one person, but many more, in order to reflect what society looks like in the inside.
Absolutely. And Harpreet, I know you wanted to quick comment before the next question.
Yeah, I just want to give an experience, an insight to one of my experiences. So when I was 17, I was the first and the only person of colour, BIPOC, to be an Australian delegate at the United Nations for the Commission on the Status of Women in New York. And it was then through working with other organisations and breaking that glass ceiling, then allowing and pushing for other young people, especially people of colour, to have that opportunity to be in those spaces. So it's really important to, I guess, when you have an opportunity, when you have a platform, to bring up others with you, and especially with these systems as well, like with high-level advocacy, it's a really hectic place, and it's very tokenistic. It can be very tokenistic and quite racist as well. And being firm with your views and your values and knowing who you are and the people and the ancestry that are behind your back, as well as working in grassroots, and as well as working like on international levels. It's important to work with all systems, and you can't really have one without the other without changing structure and all the system inequalities that exist.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Harpreet. We've got time for maybe like 2 more questions. So I found another one that I'm keen to hear from, I think this is from Teresa from AFAWN. I haven't said that correctly, but AWAFN. The question is, which strategies are mainstream services putting in place to increase access to young people and their services? So I guess if I can reframe that question a little bit, we have people in our audience from mainstream youth services and settlement services as well. What do you think that mainstream services could do in terms of strategies to include more of the voices of migrant refugee young people?
I can jump in first. I think I'm listing out a number of things. We've talked a lot about embedding young people at every stage, at every level of organisations. And I think one of the clear solutions is to really see if there are different pockets or different levels where you can employ young people within those networks, and to take a really diverse approach to doing that. If you don't know how to effectively run that recruitment process, ask young people. There are plenty of great startups, social enterprises, plenty of great young leaders, young people who are just graduating from university, entering the workforce, young people who have already been in the workforce for a few years, who can offer valuable insights. And I think creating those different positions and backing them with a good pay packet, or if you're going to get them as an intern and give them some sort of remuneration, that is the way to go about it. There's no different science to it. I think there's no point in bringing in some sort of external organisation who are more often than not run by white people, like especially if we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion experts and things like that, which is fine, but you need to be hearing it directly from the group that you want to be targeting. So create employment opportunities. And if you don't have the capacity to do that, having a really great something like a youth advisory group that has power to influence an organisation, that actually sits at a board level, is another great way to do it. I'm a huge fan of it because I came through a youth advisory group, and I like to think that that's where I kind of grew up, kind of completed my cycle of life. But doing those sorts of things are really great initiatives. But I think one of the really cool things I'd like to see is, if you are a youth organisation or someone from a youth organisation, to kind of see if you can get a young person on your board or support young people to shadow the people on your board, because why not?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've really covered a few things there in terms of that. Again, I mentioned it, but it's like that layered response, put us in the boards, put us in the leadership, because we have the skills and we have the capacity to be involved in those things. Just to repeat the question for some of the other panelists to jump in, how do you think young people from migrant refugee backgrounds can be more involved or in mainstream services, or how can mainstream services create strategies that involve migrant refugee young people?
I just want to quickly jump in and comment on Swathi's point. I think that the first thing that an organisation must do is to reflect upon their governing structure. It's really important to recognise whether you have that youth voice within your boards, whether you have youth representation within the organisation. Because if you don't highlight the missing representation within your governing structure, how do you expect to create that change? And I think that Swathi did absolutely hit it on the hammer when she noted that it is really important to have young representation on boards or young people working within organizations, because too often when you don't have young representation within your governing structure, unfortunately your work within youth can ultimately look tokenistic. So it is, what my suggestion would definitely be, is to reflect upon your governing structure and to definitely recognize where you have those missing loopholes within your organization that don't actually cater to young people's voices at the predominant standard. Because if you don't have that young representation, if you don't have that youthful representation within the boards, unfortunately the strategies that you do implement aren't coming from what young people want, but rather what the older people want within this governing structure.
Absolutely, yeah. Does anyone want to add to that before I move to the next question?
Yeah, we'd like to add having that capacity building for those mainstream services, as well as for us to be a part of them, to making it into a brave space to be a part of, and not something that's tokenistic, as Zahra said.
Yeah.
And to really make sure that, people, BIPOC people, aren't just the advisors, they're as well as the people who are in those positions, and they're not represented through someone else's voice, and that their representation is their own voice, and to not take away the power, and pretty much as well as providing power platform. Yeah.
Absolutely. Butrus, so you unmuted yourself. Do you want to add?
I think just to add to what Swathi, Zahra and Harpreet just said, I think to avoid being tokenistic, it's important to have it as part of your structure. It's a living everyday thing that you do. It's not a, oh, look, we need a young person from this kind of migrant. Oh, let's look at our database and see who we've got and let's contact people. These kind of people should already be part of your program, should have been already part of your plan. So then it's not a tokenistic, we need kind of help situation. So yeah, definitely part of your structure, part of your board, part of everything you do. I guess it is no longer we're providing services for them, but it's now that these services are for all of us kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And embedding proper training and support if you're going to do that. Don't just throw them in there. Train your staff, train your organisations, and invest in organisations that create training. Invest in organisations run by people of colour that create and run these trainings. There are a lot of them. So really, really try and create those meaningful supports as well.
Yeah, I think that's such a really important point, Swathi, to finish up that question is capacity building in mainstream organizations is critical. You know, the way you interact with migrant refugee communities, it's not sort of a cookie cutter approach, and I don't think mainstream organizations should take a cookie cutter approach. It's very much capacity building, teach people how to, or train people how to have conversations and what to access, I suppose, as well. The next question is from Christine, and it's sort of towards mental health a little bit. The question is, how can we or councils on the mental health system offer meaningful support, is what I'm going to round it up to. Is it possible, or do we need to find ways to do COVID-safe face-to-face appointments for refugee and migrant young people? So I'm just going to, again, redraft that question a little bit. How can you meaningfully offer mental health and well-being support to migrant refugee communities, especially during COVID, that you can't really see each other?
Have it be someone who is a migrant refugee who is a counsellor. I think it's the main one. But as well as making sure there is that cultural awareness and like cultural diversity in these like therapist services, and to ensure that when for there to because the first appointment and the first time someone's sharing their story is the most important moment, and you don't want someone to do damages if it is a person that's on the receiving end of hearing the story. And so it definitely needs to be as deeper as possible, and I think that's something, the accessibility towards that therapy services, and then having it be more inclusive to anyone who wants it.
Right.
I think to add on from my perspective, I think understanding what safe services, safe places are, or safe haven are for young people, and how that differs not just between communities but between individuals. For example, let's say a group of males, a safe place for them to talk about these kind of stuff may not be an office or a room. It might be out on a basketball court. It might be after a football game. It might be after a fishing trip. So being adaptable and understanding, and also understanding the cultural stigma to seeking those sorts of help, and maybe instead of them coming to you, you going over to them, kind of a situation. So adapting, changing, understanding culture, and understanding the needs of the young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Being creative is so important, but like Harpreet mentioned, embedding bicultural workers is a really huge deal, to have that representation and have that understanding and that knowledge. But it's also really important to recognise that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And these are some really heavy topics that we're talking about when we're talking about matters of race and inequality and injustice. And so what it is important to remember is that if you are a professional working in that space, or you work with professionals in that space, is that it's just important to be curious and to be respectful. And I think those aren't things that you need to get a university degree to learn how to do. Those are things that are just inbuilt within us. And if you have the desire to create that safe space, that young person will engage with it and will respond to it. But young people are very good at figuring out if something's tokenistic or something's like not quite real, or you're just pretending. Like, they're just really good at it, right? And they're never going to come back to you. And I can see that both from lived experience, but also just from now being in a space to be around professionals who work with young people as well. So being really creative, like Butrus said, is going to be so interesting to see into the future. We're seeing alarming rates of domestic violence. We're seeing alarming rates of mental illness going up and up and up. And when we're talking about reaching and providing meaningful access to refugee and migrant communities, we need to be thinking about both discrete entry points. We need to be thinking about the traditional model of care in delivering appointments, and how we can change that to create spaces where we're going out and reaching those young people directly, we're going out and reaching families directly and taking more holistic approaches, and recognizing that not everyone needs therapy in the same way. Some people might need resources, some people might need referrals, some people might just need a friend to talk to. We're seeing a lot more peer support models and different models of care coming up now, but I believe that that's because they're being informed by young people like this breaking ground.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, one really quick thing as well. We're all not homogenous. Every young person of color isn't homogenous. Even our culture, coming from an Indian background, there's so many cultures and there's so many intersections, and to really have that way of thinking and really pretty much change, I guess, the way that the mainstream mass media has portrayed young people of color as well, and for us to be to promote the positive sides of our stories and to not be gathered into one clump of people, because we're all not the same, but we all share the same experiences growing up in Australia of identity and wanting belonging, and having that difficulty time of doing all that and fitting into these worlds, and becoming our own in this, and trying to define our own in this world. Yeah, that's all I'd like to add. Sorry.
Great, thanks, Harpreet. You've kind of sort of touched on this, but not really, and this is sort of the final question I'll just pull out from the audience Q&A before we start wrapping up. But so we briefly touched on this. Have you seen that discrimination, prejudice is an issue in the time of COVID-19? And can you talk a little bit about that? What you've seen, basically. Maybe Butrus? Yeah, great.
Oh, I was like, is that to all of us? Yes, unfortunately, like we said, COVID has brought out the ugly side, and and the funny thing for me, I see it's not something that's new. It's things that have already existed, but have kind of been kept quiet for a while. When we talk about representation, I talk about representation even in the media space, in our news channels and all that kind of areas. You'd hear news broadcasters or things written about migrants not understanding, not adapting to change, and are the spreaders of the virus because they are not adapting to the Australian culture and changing like with everybody else. But what is not acknowledged is the change that the migrants have made in that difficult time that they're currently in. I'll put my parents, for example. They're, with our religious things that they go to, they had to adapt and they had to get used to doing online Zoom calls and getting on the phone and all that kind of stuff. And, from our backgrounds, we're used to being around all our family members, all our cousins, and that was important for also our mental health and our social life. But we've also had to adapt to that change in order to follow the rules and to make sure that, the disease does not continue, the virus does not continue and spread. But that hasn't really been acknowledged, and the work that the young people have been doing in the community, whether they're translating, whether they're supporting, that has not been. So it's almost because there is no representation in there, those stories are not shared. Instead, the negative stories are shared, and then the negative stories have a negative impact on us as an individual. I'm a South Sudanese individual. Now, if I hear something on the news about South Sudanese people not doing the right thing, I'm not going to shy away from that and go, oh no, I'm doing the right thing because that's me, that's my people. I am part of them. Anything that is said about them is said about me as well. So I think it's brought an ugly truth to it, and it's kind of like almost blame the minorities. Who can we blame for our problems? Instead of it's we're all in this together. It's, some of us are doing the right things, others aren't doing the right things. We need to acknowledge that, yes, there is some struggles, and yes, there is some areas to work on, but highlight the hard work that the young people have been putting into their communities, the work that the elders have been putting into the communities, the ones that have gone out speaking in all different languages to make sure that everybody gets the message across. And the message has been getting across, and I think they've done a tremendous job. And if you look at the statistics, they've done an amazing job, but we need to really highlight that and encourage that and put that live so other people go, oh yeah, they are doing a fantastic job. I think for me, it's important to look at the positives and the great stuff that people from refugee and migrant backgrounds have done through this tough time, instead of the negative stuff that media tries to kind of push on and tries to kind of push their agenda towards, which works because for someone who doesn't do their research and doesn't watch any other broadcasts or anything like that, what you say is what I believe. Now you say something about those kind of people, I'm going, yeah, that's what they do. They're the problem. They're their issue. And now that's automatically reflecting racial issues. I'm now profiling people and going, yeah, they're the people that are spreading the virus because they're not staying at home.
Absolutely.
So sorry about that.
No, important things to say. It's definitely not around. I think it needs to be said. People need to hear this stuff. I might redirect it as well to Zahra. Is there anything you want to add?
I think Butrus definitely hit it on the nail. Unfortunately, I think that what we've failed to acknowledge during COVID-19 is just because you don't find something racist or discriminatory doesn't mean that an entire group will. And it's really important to validate other minorities' feelings during this time. This is a very emotional time for different minority groups. And we've seen a surplus of issues that have arisen with COVID-19, such as Pride Month, which was recently around the corner, Black Lives Matter parades. And I think that unfortunately, we can't just slide issues to the corner. We have to really acknowledge that these issues are everyday issues that are occurring overtly and covertly. And I think that issues that, as Butrus did mention, issues of discrimination that weren't racist to the eye pre-COVID are fortunately shedding light upon right now. And I think that it is really important to validate the feelings of those that are feeling discriminated against.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We have covered everything, I think, that we can basically touch on, or most things that we can touch on. It's been a very dynamic conversation. Thank you to the audience member for putting in your questions. We're about 10 minutes from wrapping up, so I'm just going to, I'm going to kind of start finalizing this. We're coming to an end. It's been incredibly reflective, insightful, and thought-provoking, and I've had a great time chatting to all of you. I'm sure everyone has had a great time listening. To wrap up, I'm wondering if you could leave us all with just a few final thoughts. Swathi, can we start with you?
Yeah, I'll definitely kick off, and I love that Butrus and Zahra touched on that last, because I think that there was a lot that I wanted to say at this point, but I think instead I'll say that standing in solidarity with other communities who are experiencing disadvantage or who are on the receiving end of a lot of the discrimination that's going around as a result of COVID-19 should be a priority for us and for everyone, while maintaining the health and community care of everyone is going to be a priority going forward forever. We have a responsibility to stand in solidarity with these communities, to protect them, to raise our voice when others raise their voice, to put them down or to disadvantage them, and to use the privilege and the power that we have at all levels, because of course we know that it's not a simple thing. We know that it goes to various levels, and it's a very complicated issue, wherever we can, to use that position and power for the greater good and to support those who are up and coming. And having said that as well, to anyone who is out there who works with young people who are impacted by mental health, to any young people who are living with a mental health condition during this time, I see you and I'm with you, and even though it's a scary world, there are a lot of people out there who are striving to make change. And I think the way to support yourself during this time, or if you're working with young people who need that support, is to just do your best to connect them and remember that every little thing that you do, even if it's just a 5-second chat, even if it's just a phone call, even if it's just a follow-up, even if you're dropping a friend a message, I believe that every little bit counts, and nobody should put themselves down or really question what they're doing if you have every intention of supporting someone and of bringing them forward. So really of just wanted solidarity.
Great, thanks, Swathi. Butrus, final comments, final thoughts?
Final thought, definitely. I think the conversation's been great. I think one point I'd like to definitely highlight is too many times young people are told that they're the leaders in the future, where, you know, you're the leaders in the future, you're the leaders in the future. But I personally believe we're the leaders of today shaping our future. we need to be involved in these conversations because they impact us right now and they will also impact us in the future. To any services, government agencies, anyone working in this sector, it's important to see what other young people or groups of young people from multicultural backgrounds and refugees are doing in this space. Get in touch with the MYAN group in Victoria, get in touch with the MyQ Council group in Queensland and see how they could support. We're just the surface, we're just the ones that you see at the moment, but there are some tremendous people that I especially work with who have different expertise and different information in that space. So get in touch, come to some of the meetings, and they will wow you. That's something that I will definitely tell you. They will wow you, but also value their time. We're always out to jump out and go, yes, sweet, we'll volunteer, but value their time and put something back into them. The last point that I'd like to add is it's important to highlight, if I could put my sports in a cap on for a second, I understand that there's going to be a lot of shift in fundings and businesses changing things. It's important to forget that what might seem not important to you might be a huge importance to some of the young people in that space, especially in that sports sector, which is supporting in that mental health space. So, if you're cutting any sort of fundings or in your workplace or redirecting financial support, just understand what that might impact that group, especially if they've been doing such great work already and there's such amazing programs happening in that space. You cut that funding and you've kind of cut that progression. And the last point that I'd leave everybody with is, for us as young people, I truly believe that any decision that is made about us, without us, is not for us. So take that into consideration. Any decision that is made about us, without us, is not for us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Butrus. Very wise words. Harpreet, final thoughts to share?
I may go after Zahra. I'm still thinking.
Okay, great. Zahra?
Thanks so much, everyone. Just wanted to quickly highlight that I think Butrus and Swathi, and I'm sure Harpreet will cover it all. The only other point that I had to make is that it is really important to recognise yourself as an ally during this moment. We've certainly seen a plethora of issues that have arisen with COVID-19. So it is really important to declare yourself as an ally. But in saying that, we must not abuse our privilege and recenter these issues around our allyship. It is really important to focus on your actions during this time to ensure that you're not speaking over the voices that do matter the most during this time, the voices that have been essentially neglected during this time. So remember that allyship is not about recentering yourself as the center of attention. It is also about ensuring that the voices that have been neglected are the voices that must be empowered.
Yeah, thank you, Zahra. Harpreet?
Final thoughts. Yeah, I definitely think we need more conversations, dialogues, and moments like this, where you hear our voices and you hear us and not have it be, you're listening to us, and that's very much appreciated for your active listening and for being a part of today, taking your free time to listen to us. I feel as though it feels like the world is, I guess, at a stage where it just feels a bit like there's always so much going on, so many causes to be passionate about. And I think us as workers in this space, us as individuals, and us as allies as well, to pick the causes that are most valuable to us and work together in ensuring that pretty much we are building that safer, secure world for those the upcoming generations, and to allow the upcoming generations to witness and just seeing us as having that representation and seeing that people of color can do so much and have achieved so much and have fought the same wars. They too can fight these same wars of racism and misogyny and so many issues that exist. And yeah, definitely thank you. Yes, that's all. share.
Thank you, Harpreet. I think the couple of like big highlights I've got from our discussion today is that, you know, empathy and unity is something that we need to carry forward. We need to have it now, but we need to not let go of it as we move forward. You've mentioned representation on all facets. Represent us on our screens, in the boards, in strategy, and represent us for our expertise. You know, young people are experts at what they say. They're experts of their lives. Value that expertise. And lastly, I think the biggest one that I got was about an investment. So, you know, it's not just it's a monetary investment in young people's lives, but it is also a vision, a passion investment into young people's lives. So thank you so much for sharing all of those with the panel today, with myself, and thank you everyone else who's been listening on Facebook and on Zoom for joining us today. This kind of takes us to the end of our event. We hope that it's not the last time we hear from this group of people. So if you need to like contact them, look them up, they're incredible. You get them on your panels, get them on your boards, but also we hope this is not the last time that we connect with you, and we look forward to continuing these conversations. If you're not already, to stay up to date with what MYAN is doing, feel free to jump onto our newsletter, and you can sign up to that on our website or our mailing list. And you'll also be able to kind of stay in touch with what our youth ambassadors are doing by jumping onto there. Thank you, everyone. I hope you continue to look after yourselves, stay safe, take care, show empathy, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.